Hey guys, this is Robert Breedlove, and welcome to episode 2 of the Sailor series on the What is Money show. So, in episode 1, we covered the rise of man through the Stone and the Iron Ages. So, we went into ancient technologies, we talked about fire, we talked about missiles, and we talked about hydraulics facilitated by water. And now, in this episode, we're going to go a little further in the historic arc of man, and we're going to get into the Dark Ages. We're going to learn how missing one key step along the path of civilization can actually cause us to slide backwards and to regress, and that civilization is not a guarantee, right? It is something that must be continually pushed forward and maintained across time. And we'll also get into how humanity re-emerged from the Dark Ages ultimately into the Industrial Age and the Steel Age, which enabled a lot of very important technologies like cities and aviation and railroads, things of this sort. So we're going to touch on, again, the benefits that are offered by standardization and also the benefits of protocols, similar to the ones we talked about in ancient Roman times earlier, and how the economic benefits of these standardizations to one language or one protocol actually accrete to civilization. So these cost efficiencies accrete to us in the form of being able to satisfy wants faster, cheaper, and better. And that's actually the force that drives civilization and increases both economic and network density for mankind. We're also going to talk about how violence and monopolization have shaped the course of history, how violence has been used to extract rents and taxes, how gatekeepers have influenced the course of history, and how monopolies have developed in both a natural and an unnatural way. And then we'll also talk about packaged foods and how much of an influence that had on civilization, enabling us to store energy in a leak-proof container, and also how mankind's ability to eradicate some infectious diseases was such a huge boon to humanity. In terms of increasing life expectancy and quality of life overall. And again, the general aim of this is to construct a solid intellectual foundation on which to understand the profound impact that we believe Bitcoin will have on the world. And you can think about Bitcoin, as Saylor refers to it, as an engineering breakthrough. And that for the first time in history, we have a technology that is able to store the energetic life force that money represents. Again, we can think of money as a claim on all other sources of energy in the world, right? Whether it's capital, chemical energy, kinetic energy, food energy, all these types of energy. Money acts as a kind of meta energy. And we've never had a monetary technology that was totally leak-proof and that it did not lose value over time. So hopefully by drawing analogies to these very important innovations across history, you'll start to have an emerging realization of the real importance and significance of Bitcoin. So with that, let's jump into episode 2, and at the end of this, I'll do a little outro to hopefully synthesize some of these ideas. All right, thanks.
We have the rise of man through the Stone Age, and it took quite a long time, but we got here. That's impressive. We have the Roman rise, and we saw a sophisticated society mastering energy networks, logistics networks, advanced tools, political processes, in order to dominate their sphere of influence. And by the age of the Antonines, around Trajan, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius. Those are like 100 years. It's a golden age of Rome. And that's like 90 AD to 180 AD. The average life expectancy of a Roman is 72. And so if you've got baths, you've got writing, you've got civilization, you've got sanitation, you've got aqueducts, you've got roads. They've got stuff pretty well organized, some sophisticated machines. And then, of course, we take a hard left turn into the Dark Ages, and stuff just starts to break down. And it's a reminder that that nothing is certain. If you miss a key insight, you could waste 1,000 years. And stuff could have happened a different way. It didn't. For example, let's take the printing press. The Chinese developed printing presses way back 2,000 years ago. They never really thought to commercialize them. And the Chinese alphabet is a pictographic alphabet. And so you would have needed 25,000 different type pieces in order to have like movable type in a printing press. And so they had the wrong language to develop printing presses. The Romans had the Roman alphabet, which is an ideal language because you could actually print anything with just like 26 or 50 pieces of movable type. And they had all the knowledge, but for some reason, they just anybody could have figured it out, Robert. Like, all you got to do is walk in your boots through the mud and step on a nice floor and look down. And there's the idea for a printing press.
Yeah.
Tracks in the mud, right? They had paint, they had dyes, and they're just so close, and then they don't hit it. And we wait until 1453 or something for Gutenberg to work this out, and we're going to suffer for 1,000 years. It's amazing to me how certain things can be just right in front of a civilization and they just won't grab them. Like, if you go to St. Peter's Square, to the Vatican, and you look at that column, I think that used to be, it's now St. Peter's column, but it used to be Trajan's column. And Trajan's column was put up, on the, to celebrate the triumph of Trajan and his wars. And it's a bas relief, a marble relief of the Dacian Wars. And it spirals up the column, had a little staircase in the middle of it, a work of art, an architecture. And at the top, eventually the Roman Catholics put the statue of St. Peter, I guess. And in the ancient Roman times, that had Trajan's statue on it. And Trajan is standing there in his imperial robes, and he's holding his hand up in the air. And do you know what he's holding in his hand?
I don't know.
He's holding the world, and it's round, Robert. He's holding the globe in his hand, and this is 100 AD. Fast forward 1,400 years, and people think the world is flat. It's like the Romans knew the world was not flat.
Right.
And if they hadn't ripped his statue off the column 1,000 years earlier, or whenever they ripped it off and buried it somewhere, they would have known the world was round. And it's so ironic that you could learn and then forget such a basic thing.
Right. So there is the possibility of significant civilizational regression if we ignore those learnings that we've accumulated over time.
And you can go backwards and you think, well, we got it. And if we do this, we're going to leap forward into a new progressive era. But if we kill it at a pivotal point, maybe people forget it ever existed, like letting that fire go out.
Yeah.
I'll tell you another one that blows my mind. If you go to the Museum of the Native American Indian or Native American in Washington, D.C., and you walk around, you see there's an entire civilization. I mean, they're pretty much hunter-gatherers. And if you want to understand how hunter-gatherers lived, I mean, the American and Native Americans, the way they were when the Europeans showed up in America, is probably your best proxy for what the Paleolithic man was, I guess. But amongst all the artifacts they gather, if you walk around, you eventually find a pottery wheel. And the pottery wheel, it's a wheel in stone, and it's got a beautiful piece of pottery. And the sign says, glowingly, Native Americans had very sophisticated pottery, and they knew how to mold clay, and they used this pottery wheel to do it. And I look at the wheel, and I think, for 5,000 years, nobody in the entire continent thought to take the wheel and turn it this way and roll it.
Right.
Like, they knew a wheel. They knew a wheel was useful.
Yeah.
I give you the wheel, Robert, but they never invented the wheelbarrow. They never invented the wagon. There's no rolling stock anywhere in America.
Incredible.
And, and so you're like, think about the consequences of that insight. Like, how is it possible that not a single person in the entire continent ever thought they might want to turn the wheel this way up?
Right.
But it's such a profound idea.
Right.
And yet you can go 1,000 years and not get that idea.
Do you think there's any modern examples that jump to mind, that's something that's maybe glaring at us in the modern age that we're ignoring, or something that maybe we've forgotten or we're no longer respecting?
Well, Robert, the blockchain and Bitcoin is a wheel. It's I can use this stuff if I turn it this way, It's I take a couple of, they're not complicated ideas, public, pretty good privacy, private key encryption, hashing,
right?
Like, no one of them on its own. I mean, they've all been sitting there, and someone says, well, what if I just do that with it? And I start this fire, and I rub two sticks together, or maybe I just never think to rub two sticks together.
This calls to mind your example of the Roman hierarchy as well, that because everyone knew they were being watched, right? It maximized their accountability and therefore their performance and competence. And the Bitcoin network's sort of the same. You have all the nodes and miners looking at one another's activity to make sure everything's above board all the time, right? It's instantly auditing itself constantly in real time.
And you could say, right, the Romans were healthy as long as they kept tension and dynamism and this incredible competition in their ecosystem. And when they lost it, they lost their edge. Right. And then, when you look at the classic guns, germs, and steel type narratives, like the Europeans, they got hardened and tougher because they were always fighting with each other, and living with your animals made you tougher, and having people come through from Asia made you tougher. And, and as soon as you try to insulate yourself from those stressors,
right,
then your civilization forgets how to do things, or never figures it out.
Right. Taleb calls the stressors are the information, right? So you're actually cutting yourself off from the information flow that's driving your adaptation. So, yeah.
So one way or the other, we meander through that, but it strikes me that it didn't have to last as long as it did. Life expectancy plunges down to 30 years from 72 years. And wow. And in a world without technology, if you don't have aqueducts and sanitation and rules, like, don't bring your horse into the middle of the village because he's going to crap all over everything and going to get sick, right? In the absence of all those orderly rules, then you you have just a degradation of the human condition. And we started to crawl out with the Renaissance, and what's interesting there, I think, is if you look at all the great cities in the world, all the great cities grew as nexus, as the central node of an empire. So Rome was the nexus of an empire. Carthage was the nexus of an empire. When they lose their empire, they collapse. The only way you generate enough money to make a great city is you have to scrape a tax off of all the energy, all the commercial value in a large place. A fisherman cast a wide net to capture the fish. That's your empire. The Roman shtick was, pay us 10% when it comes into Rome and 10% when it goes into the next port, and we'll take 20% of the value added, or maybe 30%, or whatever we're going to take, right? If you go into Venice and you look around the Grand Canal, you see all these palazzos. They're all just warehouses. I bring a ship into Venice, I offload my cargo, and then it goes out the back and it gets barged up and down the canal, and it gets transshipped to a new ship. In that world, each ship ran this route. Venice to Alexandria was one trade route. Venice to Rome is another trade route. Venice to Istanbul is another trade route. You're at the nexus. You're running these shipping networks. And of course, you got to bribe the guy in Istanbul, or maybe, your son marries his daughter, and that's how you get to come in and out of Istanbul without getting murdered or getting your stuff stolen. And eventually all the families in Venice intermarry. Like, I know you, you're my second cousin. That's how we don't cheat each other. Mm-hmm. And there's no way, you can't solve the traveling salesman problem. There's no way I can take a ship from Istanbul to Alexandria to Venice to Rome, to Ibiza or wherever I would go, right? Barcelona, right? Because I would basically get overtaxed or extorted in each port unless I actually was, friendly, right?
Right.
So the way that works is you have a hub and spoke system, and there's always one central city, and there's always one set of families or companies, and they intermarry, and they trust each other, and they just agree, I'm going to buy wheat for a nickel or for a dime in Alexandria. I'm going to bring it to Venice, and I'm going to sell it to you for 50 cents. You're going to take it to Barcelona and sell it for $1. Mm-hmm. And you're going to pay a nickel in tax to the guy on the other end. You're going to get your 45 cents. I'm going to get my 45 cents. Those guys paid $1. These guys got paid a nickel. We can play with what's the markup, right? It might be I buy it for a quarter, sell it for 50, and you sell it for 75 to the dude that sells it for $1. But invariably, it's the people at the center of the network that are actually getting 10, 20, 30, 50% of all the commerce, right. Which is all the energy. Now, and what's the definition of a smuggler or a pirate? The definition of a smuggler is someone that doesn't want to give me half their stuff.
Right.
So how do I stop that? I have to have a navy that goes to kill them. Yeah. So you have the Carthaginian navy stopping smuggling so they can tax half the stuff. And that's why Romans can't. Carthago delenda est, right? Is it like Pliny the Elder or Cato? I forget which one said in every speech he gave in the Senate for 20 years, Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. Why? Because two people can't shake down the same guy of half his stuff. There's nothing left. If I take half your stuff as a tax, I can't, it's like the tax wars.
Yeah.
The Carthaginians are taxing the shippers and the Romans want the money. So therefore, the Romans must defeat the Carthaginians. Now the Romans tax you, then they fall, and the Venetians rise. Now the Venetian Navy controls the Med. Then you've got, you ever go to Venice, there's this great Renaissance painting, the Battle of Lepanto. And the Battle of Lepanto is when the King of Spain allies with the Pope from Rome, the head of the Roman Catholic Church, and with the Doge of Venice. And those three navies fight the Turks, the invading Muslims from Istanbul. And they beat them. And it's the triumph of Christendom. But it gets you thinking about why were they all killing each other in the first place over the Med? And you realize it's because they're fighting over control of the mercantile network.
Right.
And then the next interesting observation is, you've heard the word Roman Catholic Church, right? You ever heard the phrase Venetian Catholic?
I don't think so.
There was a time when the Venetians terminated the Catholic Church in Venice. The Catholic Church in the entire Venetian Empire didn't terminate with the Pope in Rome. It terminated with the Doge in Venice. And so that means all tithes, right, all due goes to Venice and stops. You can't have an empire unless the person at the top of the empire is also in control of the religion. Because if you don't control the religion, then someone else takes half your money, you see? It's all about energy flow.
Right.
And the energy is flowing. By the way, the Pontifex Maximus originally refers to the Roman consul, to the head of Rome, right? Augustus Caesar was the Pontifex Maximus. So the Romans had it. Eventually, the high priest.
Right.
So the high priest, the Roman consuls were the high priest of Rome for 700 years. If you're elected general, you're also the priest. You run all the religious ceremonies. They didn't separate those two. And so the church and the mercantile empire and the power to tax migrates from Rome to Venice. Okay. When did Venice start to decline? When they lost control of the church.
Right.
At the end of the day, they start sinking because you can't afford to maintain those buildings. You can't afford to maintain 100-story buildings in Manhattan unless you're at the center of a financial empire.
Right.
I have to basically buy your bonds for 68 cents on the dollar and sell them at 82 cents on the dollar and cut the difference.
Right.
There are a lot of securities on Wall Street where there's only two market makers. There's the one bank and the other bank, and they trade with each other. And if you're buying at the bottom, or you're buying at the top of the spread, and you're selling at the bottom of the spread, and the spread is 2%, Robert. And so if I turn over $1 billion worth of bonds, I'm paying $20 million in commissions, and there's a monopoly there. And the $20 million is just flowing into what? It's flowing into the building, right. And my buddy works for that bank and I work for this bank, and we drink together and we just kind of joke about the 200 basis point spread.
Interesting. So it's these groups sort of competing to be the head gatekeeper in a way, right? But to preserve that gatekeeping, it's intimately connected to the church control of religion, I guess you might say. So does this somehow connect the actual connections between money and religion? Like even today we have "In God We Trust" on the U.S. dollar bill, for instance.
It takes us to the Reformation. By the way, if you go to Amsterdam is the city of canals. It's a big if you've ever seen a distribution center, it's the trucks come in one side, it goes through a very complicated set of conveyors, and it goes out the other side. These trucks come from the manufacturers. Those trucks go to the stores or the locales. And this distribution center is a maze of conveyors. Amsterdam's that, but it's that for barges before we had machines. That's what Venice is. That's what every great mercantile, that's what they did in every mercantile center. And when you get to, Martin Luther's time, you realize one of the key drivers is there's no way that we can rise or elevate our civilization if we have to send all of our money to Rome.
Right.
You see this struggle throughout medieval history. William the Conqueror had that struggle. You see the struggle of the Northern European German nobles, and then of course it punctuates itself with Henry VIII, who eventually forms the Anglican Church, so he can be the Pontifex Maximus. And if the church terminates with the King of England, they don't have to ship any money, down to Italy, nor do they have to ask permission to change their alliances and get married and do what they will. It's useful to have God on your side. It's always been useful. Right. And so that drives a lot of stuff throughout the Renaissance, and it drives you can say that Northern Europe broke off from the Roman Catholic Church for religious reasons, or you could say the Northern European powers that be created the religion for political reasons and economic reasons to break off from the Roman Catholic Church. But either way, it's kind of a triumph of history that everybody's forgotten that there used to be lots of, why do they call it Roman Catholic if there weren't other Catholics? How many different branches of the Catholic Church do you think there were? Like 1,000. There could have been a lot. They just kind of coalesced over time. But here's the general principle. Everywhere on earth where you see a big city, it was the center of an empire. Paris, London, Hong Kong, New York, Venice, Rome, everywhere. And by the way, everywhere where you see a city that's fallen upon hard times, that's been destroyed, its empire lapsed. Carthage, Troy, right? You could name them on and on and on, right? Yeah. Venice had an empire, lost an empire. And that's because you can't physically create this kind of economic density. I mean, you go to Paris and you look at the Cathedral of Notre Dame and you look at how much human effort went into creating Notre Dame. There are people that are selling postcards and bottled water in the shadow of Notre Dame Cathedral, making money off of tourists, where the guys inherited the concession from his father's father. And if you go back 10 generations, the concession was 700 years old. Okay, they're living off of the vestiges of an empire long past. And now the question is, what are the empires of the future? Where do they form? And that takes us really to the Steel Age. The 19th century, the robber barons and the like. And you can see with shipping networks, those canals gave way to free ports and eventually gave way to container ships. And container ships totally remade everything. And they shifted power to Singapore and Hong Kong and companies like Maersk. And ultimately, it's a low energy, it's a componentized way to move things around. The most efficient way to move anything on Earth is modern containers. By the way, the biggest rage in technology and servers today is containerized software via Kubernetes and Docker, which is the same principle as put all your stuff in a container ship, and the container goes onto a ship. They've got standard loading facilities into a port. They've got standard train cars and standard trucks, everything standardized. And the cost and the transparency of that was cut maybe by an order of magnitude with that innovation.
Right. Standardization once again. Right. So what I do have a question about these empires that we've discussed historically. Ostensibly, the purpose of an empire like this is to basically preserve the walls of the city, protect the peace, honor private property rights within that dominion, right? Enforce contract law, ensure that there's a non-violent means for dispute resolution, such that commerce can be conducted fluidly. And you mentioned the empires of the future. This is something I think about a lot, is that we've always needed this monopolist on violence to sort of honor private property rights within their jurisdiction. But another really interesting aspect of Bitcoin is that it's the first private property right that is agnostic of government completely. It's the first private property right that is agnostic of government completely, right? You don't need government to enforce your right to your private keys. It's like holding physical gold or any other bearer instrument. So I wonder how much that plays into the relevance of an empire in the historical sense, kind of going into the future.
Well, I guess, yeah, traditional empires are producing security. Like the number one export of the United States is security. Like literally, I can live in Miami Beach and I don't worry about someone shooting me across, the intercoastal waterway. And if I was in certain other parts of the world, I'd have to be surrounded by 100 bodyguards, right? So security. They have that saying about Genghis Khan. They said when the Mongols controlled all of Asia, a virgin could have ridden from one end of the empire to the other with a pot of gold on her head and not be molested. The Mongols weren't screwing around either. Yeah. You intercept their mail. If anything gets stolen, anybody gets hurt, they show up with an army and they murder everybody for 100 miles in every direction, kind of to make the point, don't F with the system. Right? Now, most of these empires, they generally provide this kind of security for their citizens, not always for the non-citizens or the aliens or the slaves or the whatever, whoever's the underclass, but they do manage to establish them. Bitcoin is a security, and Bitcoin's number one value proposition is security. It's security of energy, right? If energy is translated to money and money is translated to Bitcoin and it's stored in the Bitcoin network, you're securitizing your assets, in a cloud of behind a wall of encrypted energy. And in that regard, it provides an important right and empowerment to the individual. It hasn't quite addressed the physical security element, right? When we actually come up with something that will surround your person with a field of I guess repulsive energy,
like
your own
force field or something. Yeah.
Right. Then you will have accomplished the same thing in the physical domain that Bitcoin does in the virtual domain. But but having if I secure your life force, right? Money is energy, is life force, is money is power. If I secure your power, that can be converted into physical security, either by allowing you to travel away from the. We have the example, Nazi Germany in the 30s. All the Jews had their money locked up in Germany, and so the way the system worked is they operated as bankers, and they allowed people to launder their money out of Germany, and they would take a haircut, 10, 20, 30%. Initially, then 50%, then 70%, then 90%, until pretty soon it was like a 90% haircut to get your value out, and so consequently, people didn't want to leave, right? Mm-hmm. And so if you don't have your monetary power or your assets secured virtually, then your physical security is always at risk because you can't leave, nor can you protect yourself, right? You can't pay for anything to protect yourself, and you can't get out, or you can't pay to get out. You would think that probably one of the most useful or common, or not common, one of the compelling use cases of Bitcoin would be if I'm a refugee trying to flee a war zone. Because it's either that or gold. And the problem with gold is there's a lot of people with guns. They're going to take it from you.
Yep.
And at least with Bitcoin, you could pay the guy with the gun half the money when you started and the other half when you got there. And the worst he can do is blow your head off, but he's not getting your money. Whereas if you got gold, he just blows your head off, takes the gold.
Yep.
So yeah, I think it's second order beneficial to physical security in a lot of different ways, and it makes the world better. But it's first order beneficial to economic security. If we think about the steel age, these rail networks are another network to deliver energy faster, stronger, smarter, harder. Of course, at the nexus of every transportation hub, there's an economic center. So railheads. If a great city isn't a port, it's at the center of a railroad juncture. Mm-hmm. And when you bring in, a lot of times, sometimes at the center of the rail juncture, you can tax all the trains. So if goods come from Spain into Paris and they're going to Germany, the French get to take a tax right there in Paris. So the railheads became a nexus. The other fascinating thing about the railroads is they became really instrumental to logistics movement of armies, and they drove economic and political power. And one interesting example is Winston Churchill, when he was like 25, he wrote a book called The River War before he was famous for anything. In fact, he was quite the adventurer. He went off to fight in the war in the Sudan under Kitchener. And the entire book is about the British working to win a war in the Sudan, and they had to take Khartoum, and it's like going 1,000 miles up the Nile, maybe 1,500 miles up the Nile, across desert. And why would they want to do it? It's a very interesting question. But here's the bottom line. The entire outcome of the war comes down to the question, can the British build a railroad to Khartoum? And if the British succeed in building a railroad, they win. And if they can't build a railroad, they can't provision the army and they can't move their heavy equipment, and they lose the war. The entire war, it's called the River War, but it ought to be called the Railroad War. It's just about building a railroad across a desert. And at the end of the day, as soon as the railroad arrived, a bunch of guys with explosives and Gatling guns showed up. They, devastated everybody, and it was not a fair fight at all. Like Gatling guns versus guys with spears and musket loaders, and it's kind of very unpleasant. If you read it through the modern view, it doesn't necessarily leave you a good taste in your mouth, but it's a reminder that a lot of times the difference between winning and losing and living and dying is do you have railroads? I think there's a similar story in the American Civil War. If you look at the way railroads functioned, and even the conquest of the continent, right? The Union Pacific Railroad, and once the railroad crossed the continent, it's a manifest destiny. Mm-hmm. The United States was going to dominate. Without that railroad, was it 1,000 times more expensive to move stuff overland?
Right. Yeah.
Google is, they're very good at saying, we don't do anything else that's going to be 10x or 100x better. I mean, so that's a Silicon Valley trope. Don't bother to do it unless you're going to have a breakthrough that's 100x. And well, all these things were 100x better. But a railroad we take for granted. It could be, I give you 5 tons of stuff, carry it from New York to California. count the amount of energy it's going to take you. Now put it on a railroad car. Try again.
All right.
You think that's not faster and stronger? 1,000 times faster? 1,000 times stronger? Something like that. Orders of magnitude. And that takes us to John D. Rockefeller, right? Before Standard Oil comes along, people are actually hunting whales. They're getting in wooden ships, chasing around the Indian Ocean to kill a whale, boil down its blubber, make kerosene, and burn a lamp.
Yeah.
Not a very efficient way to gather energy. So then along comes oil, and oil is 1,000 times more efficient way to get energy. And what Standard Oil was it was first an energy producer, but it was also an energy storage device. It's a battery, right? Because the best way to store energy is put it in a tank. It was also an energy network. Standard Oil, they bought up they didn't actually buy the fields, they bought the refineries. They refined the oil, they stored the oil, they bought up all the tanker cars, they bought up all the tanker ships, they locked down all of the networks, and they basically had an energy network. They actually had guys driving around with carriages to deliver, their energy to every single retail store. They had retail distribution. They would even give away the furnaces to sell the energy. They did a Jeff Bezos thing. Amazon Prime. People think Jeff Bezos invented it. He didn't invent it. I mean, if you read the biography of John D. Rockefeller, Rockefeller invented it all. He did it all. He gave away, the razors to sell the razor blades. He's the first guy to realize that, by the way, that you have to form a cartel, or you have to form some kind of understanding of scarcity. If there's no scarcity, there's so much volatility that the market is chaotically destructive. So you had the world's first serious energy network there. And it's such a powerful network that 100 years after Rockefeller's dead, those companies still are worth $1 trillion, right? They're still instrumental.
Yeah. What does that mean? That you said that Rockefeller realized he had to institute a cartel in order to, I guess, impose scarcity on the market, such to offset volatility. Can you elaborate on that?
Booms and busts, like people would. Well, you talk about scarcity. The problem of using a commodity as money is when the price goes up, people produce too much of it.
Supply goes up. Yeah.
Well, so it was a very inefficient industry with massive volatility. And so he consolidated it to drop the volatility so that they could standardize every component along the way.
Interesting.
So that he could drive to a lower energy level, right? I mean, a more efficient energy system. And I mean, ultimately, right, that if you want to look at the human condition, you ever get on one of those rowing machines and you row as hard as you can for an hour, and a kilowatt hour, hard to come by. And then you start to think, like, if I rowed all day long and I was an Olympic level rower, I think the sum total of my effort is like 29 cents. Like if you calculate, the value of all of your human effort and modern energy cost, a quarter, a nickel. Some people couldn't do a nickel worth of work, right? And you think about where we got to, and we got through to that by channeling this energy. And it must be, again, it's 1,000x, 10,000x more energy. In fact, just a general theme you see everywhere where there's an explosion of innovation and an explosion of vitality. Somebody tapped into 1,000x more energy or figured out how to deliver the energy.
Right.
Somewhere. Oil was originally, it was all about kerosene and lighting and then heating. And then, of course, the automobile shot it up by a factor of 10, and that was the killer app.
Mm-hmm.
But if you go on to some other industrial era robber baron type networks, here's an interesting one: Kraft, Hershey's, and Post cereal. They're technology companies. People don't think of them as that. Before they came along, there wasn't no breakfast. That people didn't eat breakfast. Kraft and Post figured out how to box cornflakes and put it. And what they did is they stabilized food energy and put it in a container that didn't bleed the energy, that didn't leak energy. If I give you a bottle full of tomato sauce, and I just make it in my kitchen, and you put it in your refrigerator, it will spoil over some period of time. How much? Well, there's bacteria in it. The origin of branding, the Kraft brand, the Hershey's brand, the whatever brand, the origin of branding is I make it in a clean room, hermetically sealed. Everybody has to clean up, scrub down, sterilize, get the bacteria off. I have machines to load the can, to seal the can, to seal the bottle. I stamp it with my brand. The number one value proposition, Robert, wasn't it's good ketchup. The number one, or it's good tomatoes or good soup or good whatever. The number one value proposition is it's not going to kill you.
Interesting.
Yeah, right? You ever actually make some leftovers and leave it in your refrigerator for 2 months and eat it? By the way, here's a better one. Why don't you make something in your kitchen and then leave it in your closet for 2 months without a refrigerator? Because they didn't have refrigerators. Frozen food came along later. And Marjorie Merriweather Post became like one of the richest women of the century. Because her father gave her Post cereal and they were able to stabilize starch in a box at room temperature. And then B, because she bought the first frozen food company, and she realized the ability to actually freeze food was going to be a game changer. And before that, no one ever frozen food before. You think they're not technologists.
Right.
It's a food energy company.
So that's what energy storage technologies, right?
I mean, you need energy in food form, in nutritional form to not die.
Yeah.
Right? If I could store it, now it's like, it's very interesting here, right? Like, can I take electricity from Detroit and deliver it to you in San Francisco today? No. Can I deliver electricity from Detroit to Grand Rapids, Michigan? Yes. When it gets to you, how long can you store it in your battery? It bleeds 2% a month. You'll probably lose it all in the year. Can I ship food from Detroit to Grand Rapids? Yeah. When it gets there, how long can you store it in your cellar? A day? A week? Well, if the answer is 2 weeks, there's no national business there. There's no national brand. The answer needs to be 3 months or 6 months. Now there's a national brand. Now it matters. So these guys that were launching these businesses, they were really launching clean room manufacturing plants that captured energy or something of value. They were store of value, Robert. Store of value that would not decay or bleed due to bacterial infestation or spoilage. And because of that, the brand became important, just like the Standard brand was important. The kerosine's not going to explode. It's clean, right?
Yeah.
Is the gasoline clean? Is the ketchup clean? You go to Hershey's, Pennsylvania, they got a factory. It's a work of art. If it's more complicated than most computer programs. They wrote a computer program in steel. It's like, don't F that up, right? Like there's no version 2 coming. Write your program in an analog computer welded in steel that takes up a football field. That's what they did. And in one end goes like milk and eggs and, and out the other end comes like boxes of chocolate bars, 50,000 an hour. And it's not just they come out perfectly uniform. It's they come out without bacteria in them, and you can put them on a shelf and they won't make your kids sick.
Right.
And therein is the rise of all of those CPG companies.
It's interesting. I love the perspective you have on all investment being an investment in technology, because that is what we are doing, right? We are making tools, protocols, technologies that basically improve our productivity. And that's how we advance, is sort of layers of these innovations on top of one another, such that basically every business is a technology business. I think that's a very unique insight I had never heard before. And then I think the other thing is the interesting connection between this hyper sanitation, right? To really make sure there's no bacteria or anything that could cause harm to the user of energy, which would be the eater of the food. How the hyper sanitation is connected to the preservation of the food or the energy store. And that seems to somehow kind of mirror Bitcoin in a way that it's got a hyper sanitary ledger, right? There's never any errors in the blockchain whatsoever, such that it preserves its sanctity maximally across time. Like it's the best preservation technology of value because there's no detritus in it, I guess you would say.
The best branded asset in the history of the world.
Right, exactly.
Maybe it's the first time someone came up with a way to cryptographically brand a security.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting idea. Yeah. Now, with regard to businesses, I would say that all of the great businesses, the growth companies, were all technology companies in their time. We're all technology companies in their time, and eventually, and almost by definition, they stop growing when they are no longer cutting edge technology companies, right? Mm-hmm. There are other businesses that are more like rent-seeking businesses, or they're concessions. The guy that sells bottled water in the shadow of the Notre Dame Cathedral, that's a business. It relies upon political largesse. Maybe there's a real estate business, right? I own that real estate, and then I sell you water or lemonade on that real estate, right? There are those kind of businesses. But the growth companies, right? Standard Oil, was a growth company. U.S. Steel, Boeing, IBM. In that period when they're growing, they're a technology company. And that means that all growth stocks are technology companies by definition. Mm-hmm. You can buy another stock that's not a growth company or a non-tech company, but it's probably not a growth stock. In order to grow a non-technology company, you could then make this the assertion that you're going to need to do financial engineering, like roll-ups, like I'm going to buy up every McDonald's or every restaurant across the country with debt. Maybe that's a way to grow it. Or you need a concession from a regulator. It's now illegal for you. I'm the only person that can operate airports in the United States. Right? I can grow that way. I need a concession, a political concession. And then I suppose there's a place for innovative marketing, but if there's not a compelling technology breakthrough, I'm just not a big fan, right, of the marketing thing, except for if the marketing breakthrough comes about due to technology. Like, for example, I created a company that got famous because I'm famous on Twitter and YouTube, and that's not a bad idea. I'm the best marketer on a new medium. Maybe that can work. But at the end of the day, those aren't going to be $1 trillion, in their day. I mean, like if the dollar's inflated or it's debased by a factor of 100 at least, well, I mean, John D. Rockefeller was worth $400 million in his money. Multiply it by 100.
Right.
Multiply by 200.
Right.
He got to being worth $1 billion, I think. So he probably was worth 200 billion to 250 billion in his money. And that was in a day where you didn't have access to all the deflationary tech services that are effectively free. Right. So relatively speaking, right, they had extraordinary power, but they were all technology capitalist. It's important at this point for us to just look at the impact of steel and aluminum through this entire era. Carnegie created an empire based on steel, and Andrew Mellon's empire was substantially based on aluminum and aluminum Alcoa. And steel is an elemental force for the civil engineering industry, and aluminum became that elemental force for aviation. Without steel, there is no modern city. You build a building in wood, it's 2 stories. Build a building in bricks or masonry, it's 5 stories as max. In order to create New York or London or any great city, you need steel and you need, of course, an elevator. Straightforward things, but of the two of them, steel is the harder development. The elevator you could probably figure out. It's a counterweight on a pulley, whereas steel is iron laced with carbon, and it's really hard. How hard? Think about how complicated it is in order to refine steel and shape steel when it's molten and it melts through just about anything you might put it in or on. If you read any books on steel, like American Steel, I think by Richard Preston, about Nucor, they talk about steel refinery blowouts. If you actually have an accident in a steel refinery, and if the molten steel falls on the concrete, there's water vapor in the concrete. So molten steel superheats the water vapor. And what happens when water vapor gets hot or water gets hot? Expands.
Yeah.
Explodes. Molten steel on concrete turns the entire refinery into a bomb, and it blows up. Wow. And it kills everybody for 100 meters in every direction. So technology or not technology? Harder technology. Everybody thinks they're in the technology business today. Nobody deals with technology that's as dangerous and tricky as what Carnegie and those early steel refiners are dealing with, or the DuPonts handling nitroglycerin. Like, what do you think happens when you mishandle nitroglycerin? When you mishandle crypto, you lose some money. When you mishandle nitroglycerin, everything gets blown up again for half a mile in every direction. And aluminum, again, not so easy either. So these are really difficult technologies, but really elemental, because the difference between steel and no steel is, do you build a 100-story skyscraper? Right? I guess you could say you might do some of it with iron, but iron's just got problems. Steel's the perfect material for civil engineering. It's cheap. It's got extraordinary tensile strength. If you paint it or protect it from corrosion, it will last forever. literally forever, Robert. If you build a steel ship and you punch a hole in it, you can weld the hole with another piece of steel, and the weld will be stronger than the original cold rolled steel. It's that strong. So in the world of strong, this is the strongest of strong materials. It's strong, it's cheap. Carnegie figured it out. They built every bridge with it. No steel, no bridges. No bridges, no Manhattan.
Yeah.
Figure out what happens if you blow the bridges in Manhattan. Everybody's starved to death. You can't even get the food in fast enough. And of course, you can't hold the skyscrapers. So all modern civil engineering is based on steel. So then along comes aviation, and they try to build a plane with steel. What happens? You ever see a steel airplane?
No.
It's the perfect material. It's cheap. It's indestructible. Why not build an airplane with steel?
Too damn heavy.
Just one little nuance, just one little problem. But the fact that it's better than aluminum in every way, shape, and aluminum's 20 times more expensive than steel. And it flexes, and it's difficult to work. It doesn't matter. Steel doesn't fly. Iron doesn't fly. Wood flies. Canvas flies. Fabric flies. But you try to find a metal which is stable, that's going to be a structurally sound metal for aviation, and aluminum's the one. No aluminum, no aviation. Nothing.
Right.
Nothing. Like you're talking about balloons, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe you got the right flyer, but it's an elemental force, and on that element, you make that breakthrough, then you have you have $1 trillion industry.
Right.
Based on that breakthrough. How do you work it? How do you create it? How do you use it?
It's so interesting that these raw material breakthroughs then have so many follow-on consequences, like first and second order consequences, to the point where you're saying no steel, no city, no aluminum, no aircraft. And then we have to think about how much commerce is actually conducted through the city and through the aircraft. I mean, it's foundational to global civilization as we know it.
And they all kind of come down to networks that move energy around.
Mm-hmm.
Standard Oil is an energy network. The railroads are energy networks, right? Oh, no railroad, no tanker car with energy on it, right? The railroad is the energy network moving the oil around. The airplanes, another energy network moving high frequency cargo around and information around.
Mm-hmm.
And each one of them, build another one, and then the food networks. And the result of all of them is there are large corporations and huge opportunities for wealth creation if you get to the node of the network.
Mm.
One last point on the steel age before we move on that's worth noting is average life expectancy at 1900 is 50 in America. It was 70 under the Romans. It was 30 in the Dark Ages. It might have been 32, 33 in the Revolutionary War in the US. We crawl back up to 50. And then by 1950, it's 70. And so probably the most rapid expansion in the quality of life in thousands of years is in that 50 years from 1900 to 1950 because of the conquest of infectious diseases. And that's all really a function of discovering the science of microbes and sterilization, understanding that you need to be sterile. And then the second is antibiotics. And those two things together were extraordinary antibiotics alone and penicillin is responsible for the defeat of tuberculosis. And tuberculosis killed 1 billion people. The White Plague. If you caught tuberculosis, it was a death sentence. I think it killed Chopin, killed all sorts of people. 1 billion people, more than any war. And of course, in this particular case, if you look at history books on the 20th century, they give it like 2 paragraphs. You could, if you were weighting the text based upon the significance of what happened, you probably something like half of all the history of the 20th century ought to be just about, penicillin, antibiotics, and sterilization, half, and everything else could be the other half. But in fact, it's not even 0.01%. The only measurable mortality rate in the 20th century is the flu epidemic around 1920, where you could see a blip. You can't see an impact on the average life expectancy of any other event, including all the wars. The wars don't. World War I doesn't register. World War II doesn't register. Nothing. It's kind of like just the impact of technology, of modern medicine and antibiotics and networks and cheap energy and sterilization and sanitation and running water. The impact of that so dwarfs every political thing that took place in the century that what you've really got, I think, is just a chart that's just a small blip in 1920. And that was like, different estimates. 100 million people died. 20 people say as much as 20%, 10 to 20% of the population died in that 1 or 2 year time frame. And they're still debating what that is, but it's the only event you can see on the chart. And all of the activities of all the politicians and all the ideologies and everything we fought over turned out to be not as relevant, as defeating tuberculosis.
Penicillin. And it was derived from a mycelium. Is that correct? It was left in a sink overnight accidentally, something to that effect.
Yeah, and it's an accident. The guy, we get it from a fungus, and it's accidental.
Incredible.
And powerful, but I don't know. I guess your takeaway from that is. Let people do their stuff and don't try to channel people in any particular direction too much. Because nature's a bit more complicated.
I think Taleb makes the point that all of our innovation is, or won't say all, we'll say the vast majority of innovation occurs through trial and error, right? This tinkering impulse that people naturally have versus this image of the inventor alone in a room laboring for 20 years straight and all of a sudden he has a breakthrough. It's more like people working and tinkering all over the world and communicating that lead to these breakthroughs.
Yeah, half of science is accidental. Yep. And half the stuff gets discovered, but the issue is no one decides to commercialize it or they don't engineer it into the solution. So there's that phrase, I think William Gibson's phrase, the future's already with us, it's just not evenly distributed.
Right. Yeah, exactly.